The night was unusually quiet in the wealthy neighborhood of Willow Creek. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches weighed down by a steady, cold rain. The storm had started in the late afternoon and refused to let up, leaving the air heavy with moisture and the sidewalks slick with water. Most houses had their blinds shut tight, warm light glowing faintly behind frosted windows. It was the kind of night when people tucked themselves inside with blankets, hot drinks, and the comfort of being safe from the storm. But not everyone was safe. Inside the largest home on the block, a sprawling mansion that looked almost out of place in its extravagance, William Turner stood in his study, staring blankly at the flames dancing in the fireplace. At 53, William was a man who had everything most people could only dream of: wealth, influence, a private company that had turned into a national giant. Yet, despite the perfection of his surroundings, he often found himself restless. Tonight was no different. The storm only mirrored the turmoil that had long lived inside him, the kind of emptiness money never seemed to fill. He sighed and decided to walk toward the massive front window that overlooked the long driveway. The rain blurred the glass, making the world outside look distorted and unreal. But then, through the streaks of water, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a shadow or perhaps a tree branch blown down by the wind. But when he looked closer, his breath caught in his throat. Two figures lay crumpled at the edge of his gate, their bodies soaked through by the relentless rain. William's heart thudded heavily in his chest. He blinked hard, thinking maybe his imagination was playing tricks on him. But no, the figures didn't move. An elderly couple, their frail forms pressed against the cold ground, lay helplessly in the downpour. Without a second thought, William rushed to the door. His polished shoes splashed through puddles as he ran down the stone steps. The rain pelted him mercilessly, but he hardly noticed. When he reached them, the sight made his chest tighten painfully. The man, with thinning gray hair plastered against his forehead, had one arm protectively draped over the woman beside him. She was smaller, her hands wrinkled and trembling as she weakly tried to shield herself from the rain. "Sir. Ma'am. Can you hear me?" William knelt down, his voice shaking. The man stirred slightly, his lips parting as though trying to form words, but no sound came. The woman let out a faint moan, her eyelids fluttering. William didn't hesitate. He slipped his arms beneath them, feeling how light they were, as though the years had hollowed out their strength. He carried them both, one after the other, through the towering gates and into his mansion. The warmth inside was a jarring contrast to the storm outside. His house staff gasped in shock as he barked quick instructions. "Get blankets. Towels. Call the doctor, now." The servants scrambled, surprised by the urgency in their usually reserved employer's voice. William laid the couple gently on a sofa near the fireplace. He grabbed a blanket himself and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. Her frail frame shivered violently, but her eyes slowly opened, locking onto his. They were a deep, tired brown, filled with fear but also something else, gratitude. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We didn't mean to, we just needed." Her words trailed off as exhaustion overtook her. William leaned closer, his heart aching. "You're safe here. Don't worry about anything right now," he assured her. Minutes later, Dr. Harris, the family physician who lived just a few blocks away, arrived, soaked from the storm. He wasted no time in examining the couple. William hovered nearby, restless and unsettled in a way he hadn't felt in years. "They're both severely dehydrated and undernourished," Dr. Harris explained quietly after a while. Exposure to the cold rain didn't help. But with rest, warmth, and food, they should recover. Relief washed through William, though questions immediately followed. Who were they? Why had they collapsed outside his gates, of all places? As the doctor tended to them, William paced. His mind wouldn't stop racing. He had lived in this mansion for nearly 15 years, yet never once had he seen people so desperate right outside his door. He had always believed problems like poverty, homelessness, and hunger existed somewhere else, somewhere far away from his carefully guarded world. But tonight, it had crashed into his reality, demanding his attention. Later that evening, when the couple had been cleaned up, dressed in warm clothes, and settled into one of the guest rooms, William returned to check on them. The woman was awake now, sipping slowly from a cup of tea one of the maids had brought. The man lay beside her, breathing deeply, still too weak to speak. "Thank you," the woman said softly, her voice stronger now. "If you hadn't found us, I don't know." Her eyes watered, and she pressed a trembling hand against her lips. William sat in the chair across from her. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're both safe. But please, tell me. How did this happen? Why were you out there in this storm?" The woman hesitated, glancing at her husband. She took a shaky breath before answering. We used to live not far from here. My husband, George, worked at the steel plant for nearly 30 years. I cleaned houses. We had a modest but decent life. But then the plant closed, and our savings ran out faster than we thought. We lost our home 2 months ago. Since then, we've been staying wherever we can, shelters, sometimes just the street. Tonight, we tried to make it to the church on the other side of town, but we didn't have the strength. We collapsed outside your gate. Her words hit William like a punch to the chest. He leaned back, stunned. This wasn't some distant story on the news. This was happening a few blocks from his mansion, to people who had once worked hard their whole lives. People who had built the very foundation on which communities thrived. And yet here they were, nearly dying in the rain outside his home. As she spoke, William's mind drifted to his own past. His father had been a factory worker too, until a lucky investment had changed everything. William had been just a boy then, unaware of how fragile stability could be. He had spent decades building upon that fortune, often convincing himself he deserved it because he had worked hard to expand it. But now, listening to this woman, he realized just how thin the line was between security and despair. He swallowed hard. "You don't have to worry anymore. You'll stay here until you're back on your feet." The woman's eyes widened. "We can't impose on you like that. We have nothing, we don't want to be a burden." William shook his head firmly. "You're not a burden. You've been through enough. Please, let me help." For the first time that night, the woman's lips curved into a fragile smile. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "God bless you." William stayed with them a little longer, making sure they were comfortable before leaving the room. But as he walked back down the grand hallway of his mansion, his steps slowed. He had thought tonight would end once they were safe. Instead, it felt like something far greater had begun. Because deep inside, William knew, this wasn't just about saving two strangers from the rain. It was about confronting everything he had ignored for far too long. The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the world outside fresh but drenched, puddles reflecting the pale sunlight. William barely slept. He had spent most of the night pacing his study, replaying the sight of the elderly couple crumpled outside his gates. He couldn't shake the feeling that fate had dragged them into his life for a reason. By the time he walked into the guest room, the couple was awake. George, though weak, was sitting up with a dignity that defied his frail body. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him, holding his hand. "Good morning," William said softly, not wanting to startle them. George's voice was gravelly but steady. "You saved us last night." "I don't know how to thank you, son." "Don't thank me," William replied. "Just tell me how I can help you now." George exchanged a look with Margaret before speaking. "We don't need charity. We need a chance. We've been invisible for so long. People crossed the street to avoid us. But you stopped." His eyes glistened. "That means something." The words pierced William's heart. He realized this wasn't about handouts. It was about restoring dignity to lives that had been stripped of it. Over the next week, William insisted the couple stay at his mansion. He provided them with warm meals, clothes, and rest. Slowly, they regained their strength. The house staff, initially skeptical, grew fond of them. Margaret would chat with the maids in the kitchen, offering old family recipes. George, though frail, insisted on helping in the garden, trimming roses and tending to the soil with a gentleness that surprised even the groundskeeper. But as the days passed, William found himself wrestling with something deeper. Their presence forced him to look at himself, to question the empire he had built. His company had grown enormous, but it had done so by cutting costs, closing factories, and outsourcing jobs overseas. Thousands of families like George and Margaret's, had lost their livelihoods because of decisions he'd signed off without blinking. One evening, William sat alone in his study, staring at the rows of awards and framed newspaper articles praising his success. For the first time, they looked hollow. What good was wealth if it left destruction in its wake? The twist came 2 nights later. George asked William to sit with him in the library. His eyes were serious, almost heavy with something unsaid. "There's something I need to tell you," George began. "I didn't collapse outside your gate by accident." William frowned. "What do you mean?" George's hands trembled slightly as he folded them together. "I knew who you were. I knew this was your mansion. I came here on purpose." The air seemed to thicken between them. George continued, his voice low. "I used to work for your father. Back at the steel plant. He was a good man, William. He cared about us, the workers. When the plant first started struggling, he fought to keep it alive. But when he passed away and you took over, things changed. The plant closed. Hundreds of us were left with nothing. I tried to forgive, to move on. But as the years passed, it ate at me. I lost my home, my savings, my pride. And when I saw your name in the papers again, celebrating record profits, something inside me broke. I told Margaret I needed to see you. I needed you to look me in the eye." William felt as though the floor had been ripped from under him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Shame and guilt pressed down on him. "You think I wanted to hate you?" George's voice cracked. "I didn't. I wanted to understand. I wanted to believe you were still your father's son. That's why we came here. And when the storm hit, I thought maybe it was judgment, or maybe it was grace that left us at your gate." William's throat tightened. "George, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," George said, his eyes filled with a sorrow that felt endless. "Because you never looked. You never came back to see the lives your choices shattered." The word struck harder than any insult could. William bowed his head, his hands trembling. For the first time in decades, William felt tears spill down his face. "I can't change the past. But I can't ignore this anymore either. If I've lived blind to the suffering I've caused, then I don't deserve the life I have." He looked at George and Margaret, his voice breaking. "But if you'll let me, maybe I can start making it right." Silence filled the room. Finally, Margaret reached out, placing her frail hand over his. "Then start, William. Not with guilt, but with compassion. Use what you have to heal, not to hurt." Those words lit a fire inside him. The very next morning, William called an emergency meeting with his board of directors. His staff had never seen him so determined. He announced a new initiative, a foundation dedicated to rebuilding lives in Willow Creek and beyond. He pledged millions to reopen community centers, fund job training programs, and provide housing for displaced families. But more than money, he promised involvement, his time, his presence, his accountability. The board resisted at first, worried about profits and shareholders. But William stood firm, his voice unwavering. "If our success means destroying the very people who built this country, then it's not success at all. I won't lead a company that forgets its humanity." News of his decision spread quickly. Some praised him, others criticized. But for the first time in years, William didn't care about public opinion. He cared about George and Margaret, about the countless faces that had once been invisible to him. Weeks later, George and Margaret moved into a modest but comfortable home William helped secure for them. He visited often, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. George, though still frail, began mentoring younger men in the job training program. Margaret volunteered at the community center, teaching children how to cook and sew. One evening, as William sat on their small porch, Margaret handed him a cup of tea. "You've changed, William. Do you feel it?" He nodded slowly, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold. "For the first time, I feel like I'm living for something real." George leaned back in his chair, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then maybe the storm brought us together for a reason after all." William looked at them both, his heart full. He had once believed his mansion, his wealth, and his power defined him. But that night in the rain, fate had shown him otherwise. True wealth was not in what he possessed but in the lives he lifted, the dignity he restored, and the compassion he carried forward. The storm had passed, but its lesson remained forever. And so did the bond between a millionaire and an elderly couple, united not by wealth or status, but by the simple, powerful truth that humanity only thrives when no one is left forgotten in the rain.